Okay, hello and welcome to the Red Pill Fiction Factory. My name's Steve. I'm standing in for Richard today as guest host, and I'm here to interview JL Engel, the author of the dark action thriller A Dangerous Man. JL, how you doing, mate?
I'm doing great, man. It's good to meet you.
That's good stuff. What have you been up to this morning?
Walking the dog, getting in some early sun. It's going to be a hot day here today, so getting some things done this morning while it's cool.
Nice.
And then this was my main thing to get done today. So looking forward to this conversation.
Cool. Whereabouts is it in the world that you are?
I'm in Washington State and in the U.S. on the leftist coast. It's a beautiful state. House. Sorry, that's my giant house hippo over there. Rocco. 9. Washington State, beautiful evergreen state, horrible politics. You know, you want to come hike waterfalls, we got it. It's awesome.
Oh, beautiful.
You know, things like that. A lot of great things to talk about, a lot of bad things too, but
yeah, a bit like everywhere really, isn't it?
Pretty much. I mean, it's people talk about their hometowns and how they always wanted to get out and go somewhere else. It's everywhere. Same like with jobs and bad bosses and things like that. It's everywhere, So, but yeah. So here I'm in Washington State, U.S.
Nice.
So that's where I'm based out of.
Cool, man. But tell us a bit about your background.
See. Where to start, I guess. I was a corrections deputy for 15 years.
Yeah.
Prior to that, I was a personal trainer. I also did some security back then too for a local agency before I got into law enforcement. I never actually intended to get into law enforcement. It was a suggestion from some clients I had when I was a trainer, because locally at the time, and this is back in like 2005, 2006, around then, wasn't making a lot of money. And I was a single dad. So I have a daughter. She's now an adult.
Oh, wow.
And so they suggested that, and I got into it and I'm like, okay, more money. And it was something I never expected to stick around in doing.
Yeah.
And, was making good money and I was really good at it. Because you have to wear a lot of hats, like I've seen with your interviews, doing security and bouncing at clubs and things like that. You got to be able to deal with a lot of different people, and honestly, the personal training and the clients and someone different every hour I would train kind of prepared me for that in a lot of ways. Not so much the meth heads and the drunks and everything. That's a learning curve.
Yeah,
but that can be fun, I guess, that sometimes. But I'm a former amateur kickboxer. I did that back in my late teens, early 20s, and always kind of gravitated to martial arts after that. Defensive tactics, became an instructor at the agency I was with, had multiple certifications through different companies to teach restraints.
Is that prior to being prison guard?
During.
Okay.
When I initially started working as a corrections deputy, and it was for our local jail in a town next door to where I live. One of the guys who was there, he was the defensive tactics instructor, and we were familiar with each other well enough, and he needed some help. He was the only one doing it. So I started initially, and then some things didn't work out in regards to administration and our lesson plans and stuff, and they weren't going to get me certified in order to be able to help him. So I couldn't do it for a period of time. And the state academy here back then had some wonky training that I wasn't a fan of. And so I was like, I'm not going there to do that. We'll have to do something else. And some years later, a coworker that kind of took under my wing, kind of like became like my little brother. He was interested in doing it, and he was asking me about helping him. And because I was just adept to doing the physical work. I had a knowledge base that was pretty broad, and I was like, not if they want to send us to the academy. I'm not doing it. And so we had talked to administration into finding other instructor certification programs we could use and everything. And so I did that for about, I think, 8 or 9 years, my last 8 or 9 years that I was there.
Cool.
And
so what was it that was wrong with the other programs? Were they just not effective?
It's not effective. The instructor there at the time was so full of himself that, I mean, they taught the same thing over and over again. Most of things some things I'm sure you would probably be familiar with if we wanted to go in depth into what that would be, but most of which is ineffective.
Yeah.
And so it just became a thing. I just didn't care for the teachers. A lot of the instructors who were there, who worked under him, were great people and knew that they were kind of, just teaching a bunch of BS. They were getting paid to be there. So, what do you do? What do you do? And they were good at what they did. A lot of these guys I knew, I found that I had acquaintances with from other gyms back when I used to fight and whatnot. And so I knew where they're from. I could be like, so-and-so, you've trained with so-and-so. I'm like, okay, I know exactly what you're capable of. And so I know what you bring to the table, and listening to them and their instruction, and it was a massive level of respect because they knew what they were doing, and they knew that what they were being kind of forced to teach because of who was in charge of everything was a bunch of crap, And so.
Sorry, did I lose you there for a sec?
Just for a sec, yeah, that's all good.
Sorry, mate.
So yeah, that was one of the big things. Passion of mine. Martial arts is something I practice mostly at home in the bag anymore. Getting to a gym has not been feasible right now, but it's something I'll get back into soon, even though I'm turning into an old man.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Sorry about that, mate. So you basically went into the personal training side of it, then got into the kickboxing through that, or was that sort of part of this two sort of came together?
Kickboxing was much earlier. I started that when I was 16. So that was like a lifetime ago. And I did that competitively for about 5.5 years. And then afterwards, in between there is when I became a personal trainer. And then that led me into law enforcement. I did security before I got actually into the jail. And then leading into that, I was there for 15 years. And then eventually I got to get my hands back into the physical defensive tactics world that I enjoy, because I learn it really easily. Like, I'm very adept to it. And so I just eat it up. I love it.
Yeah.
And so I'd been offered it a couple times from different places I trained with, to like, well, hey, we need more instructors, and it might be something I'll dip back into, looking into here sometime soon for something to do, because I've taught for a long time. I used to teach when I was at the gym, kickboxing. So I learned how to train different people. And in doing that, just kind of flowed over and transitioned into teaching the people that I worked with every day. And so I mean, not to, I was pretty good at it.
Yeah.
And especially finding different personalities and who's good at this and not at that, and trying to bring them up a level to get, on par with those who are probably more athletically adept to, performing things, and, where it just comes easy to them. Like the guys who like, give this guy this to do and he'll do it 1,000 times perfectly, like the first time. Yeah. Have some of those people and trying to gauge the range. It's a fun kind of a strategy that I've always enjoyed. And so the teaching part of it is fun.
And you're teaching people how to keep safe in a very dangerous environment. So it's
a
very important job.
Some of them don't take it as seriously as they should, which I'm sure you've seen in things you've done. And that's the concerning part of it. But that's, I mean, you can wrap that into a law enforcement in general. You know, people don't take that as seriously as they should, and it's kind of sad. It should be one of the main things you want to be good at to make sure you go home at night.
Yeah.
And
so it should be the first thing really, and the other stuff comes
really,
second.
Yeah.
I
mean, your verbal jiu-jitsu should be somewhere on par with your actual jiu-jitsu. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of places. We were very lucky, not to go on a tangent. We were very lucky at the agency I was at, where we trained more often in that than most places do. Right. And it came to learning that most agencies, whether they're jails or prisons or even police agencies or deputy, on the road operations, there's a lot of places across the country that probably because the workload and timing and having trainers where they don't train that often. Like if they could get 2 4-hour sessions in a year, like that's good for them. We would do at least 4 on schedule. Getting everybody there, that's a different story, but over time. But it was something that helped martial arts helped shape who I became. I was pretty in my shell.
In the book as well. It comes through the knowledge there. There's some great fight scenes. There's one in particular. There's almost an entire chapter. I won't give any spoilers as to how that one comes out, but it's the way the ebbs and flows of the fight, the tactics going on between the different opponents, the way they're thinking, the way they're moving. It's brilliant. It's great.
And when you've
got a lot of knowledge.
My guess is you're probably talking about the twins fight.
Yeah.
Yeah. That one was fun. That one was fun to kind of strategize, because that had to have that moment. Like I wanted it to stand out for someone who could recognize what could go into it, because it also, I would watch action movies. I would watch interviews with stuntmen, choreographing agencies like the guys who do John Wick, 8711, talking like how they kind of figure out things. Because in my head, I was like, well, I want this to kind of feel like you're reading a movie, right? The cinematic aspect to it. And how do you do that? Because you can't just have action. There's got to be a little more depth to it. Yeah. And how do you express that? So it was like changing perspectives back and forth, and trying to find that the right medium and the balance between the characters who are really kind of off the rockers and then our main guy Ghosts, and what the differences will be. And that was fun. And a lot of times I'll think about those moments where when I try to come up with fighting scenes and action sequences and what I write, it's like, I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm like, there's probably like 80 personalities up there going back and forth trying to see who's going to get involved, because you have to look at things from so many different perspectives.
Yeah.
And then try to get the reader engaged in it, it can be a challenge, but usually by the time I get there, it's begging, like chomping at the bit to get out of me.
Yeah. And I think that part really comes natural with your writing. It's really clear. I think anyone could follow it. It's so really energetic, fast paced,
Thank you, because that's one thing where I have a hard time reading things with a slow pace, because it'll take me out of it. And there's books where I'll get through parts where they're a little slower, knowing like, well, this is going to pick up, I'm ironically, I'll tell you, like, if you tell me about a show that's amazing and it's a slow burn, I probably won't watch it, because the payoff won't come soon enough for me. But if I'm invested in the story enough, I like reading wise, I will, because I've found that I'm like, well, although I'll say I don't like watching that, I also know I'm like, well, I'll actually implement that in my own into my own stories. There'll be like a little bit of a slow burn, and then once we're off to the races, I mean, it's all gas from there, you know. So, but
I say this one kicks off with a bang. The opening scene is absolutely brilliant. That opening chapter, I love that one. I won't spoil that. Would you mind telling us, give us a rough breakdown, your summary of the book itself, of the story?
Yeah, I had I'll give you a little history too, because I finished writing that story and towards the end of 2017, I think, and then I let it sit, and then I worked on it and edited. I had a couple people helping me with it initially before I started submitting it. Because once I started submitting it, I was submitting for about 18 months before, you know, and I got a few no's, and you get a lot of nothing. And if you do your research and you understand what you're getting into, you know, you're probably going to get a lot of nothing back, which is obviously a rejection, and that's whatever. And so none of that really bothered me. And then, you know, the publishers got a hold of me, and I'm like, I forgot. I didn't even realize I'd found them, like when they told me yes.
Is a publisher from over here, isn't it?
They are actually based in the UK. Yeah, it was a hybrid deal. And I'd done some research on them, and I talked to one of the guys about that because there was some pretty unfavorable stuff about it. And I was like, but at the time I felt like I was in a corner where I was like, nobody else said yes yet, you know? And all you need is one yes to get started. I was like, screw it, I'll do it. And I did. And I don't want to say anything derogatory or anything, because there's been speed bumps like anything along the way. Getting things started, they were really great, and I made plenty of mistakes, being, I think, too excited in the beginning. And so the proofs I had to do like 5 proofs over the book because some things got through that I should have caught. I didn't do my due diligence and properly reading it when editing it the first time, and it caught up with me the next few times and whatnot. So but we got it done, and I still think it could probably be edited better. I know I can be a pretty wordy writer, and I think some of that I could fix up, but I've gotten a lot of great feedback on it in terms of the scope of things. But to your question, I had that idea in my head since my daughter was born. She was born in 2003. And I started noticing things in the world a lot more. I don't know if you're a parent or not, but if you're, I mean, like you are, I assume you're probably a pretty hyper vigilant person as it is. You start seeing things on the news more often you didn't normally pay attention to. And so like, I wasn't in law enforcement yet. My daughter was 3 when I first got in the jail, and when I almost went to the state troopers too before that. They had hired me, but I'd rather stay local because I had my daughter very regularly. And see these things, it was like, what do you do? Like my inner protector wanted to reach out somehow to do something. There's nothing you can really do without getting directly involved. I mean, you can donate. Like that's why I have the statement at the end of the book. There's find organizations, trafficking, and every country has them. Every state has them here. Local ones. There's larger ones, but I had created this character to combat that evil. Yeah. And in that time was like, well, I was born in the 80s, 90s action movies, you know, Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Chuck Norris, Van Damme, Dolph Lundgren. I grew up in the one-man army era, so it was like, I gotta create my own. And so I came up with Ghosts. And I tend to lean more towards the serious, more darker side in my storytelling. And so
more like Death Wish 1 rather than Death Wish 4.
Right. Yeah. And I'd only just recently learned that was based on a book, you know, side note.
Oh yeah.
I never knew that initially. But yeah, so I came up with Ghosts, and I wanted to keep his identity a mystery, because I have more stories of him, as you can see by the end of the book, that I want to bring into him. I'm probably not going to continue with the same publisher. So I'm just waiting to get the rights back when that contract is up, so then I can start knocking out the sequels. It's the only concept I've come up with that I wanted to make sequels to. And because it's such a broad subject, and it resonates so much in this day and age. And mind you, that back then when I was researching and writing, in 2016 and everything, and reading and looking into things years ahead of time, the story marinated for like 16 years before I actually wrote it down. And about a special ops man. What's that?
Sorry, mate. Was there something in particular that got you going down that route? Was there an incident or a story or something that you've encountered as a prison guard that made you? The topic is, by the way, it's human trafficking, and Ghost is a one-man army, and he's basically going after a bunch of human traffickers and taking down their operation.
Yeah, Ghost is a former special ops operative, and his whole goal is to bring down a trafficking organization that took his family from him. And that was always the scope, because the stakes have to be high. I thought the emotional aspect had to be deep, and even with the kind of character I wanted to create, like you and I as men, and anyone who reads it, even women. I mean, I got to be honest with you, like there's a lot more women readers out there now, especially with like this kind of content. And I mean, and in a lot of reviews for you books, you've seen like a lot of, there's a lot of women who read them and are like, this is some badass stuff. Yeah. And they love it, and it's like, there's such a broad audience out there, and you talk to people and they're like, well, what's your demographic? I'm like, do you like to read badass shit? Because here's the thing, and with you and Nick and Dave, and John, and I got Richard's book I'm reading Richard's book right now. You could hand them, like, do you like to read badass stories? Well, yeah, here you go. Here's a stack that gets started with these guys, and everyone's really been super cool, but it's in that genre that I've chose to write this book in. The story that really stuck in my head was, I haven't been able to find it in the news, and I know I watched it on the news here locally. And like I said, this is back in between 2003 and 2006. It was before I started at the jail, because I would write in a notebook. I'd have an idea and kind of start jotting down notes, and then it'd go nowhere. So I hadn't written for some time at that point in my life. And this news story come on. We lived at my dad's at the time. He was up, he'd watch the news every night before he went to bed, 11 o'clock news. And there was a story that stuck with me where there was a father in Idaho, which is a state that's just east of me, didn't have custody of his two kids, kidnapped them. There was a manhunt for him, and then it ended with murder-suicide. If I remember correctly, that's what's in my head. And I was like, how can somebody do this? And then of course they do the digging and investigation, and I was like, there were signs. He threatened the mom. He threatened to kill the kids. Like, all these things that you'd think there'd be something to be able to do about it,
Yeah.
And then you take that step and you look into that story, you read about it, because I'm like, as a father, there's no way in hell I could ever possibly imagine harming a child or my child, And so it's like, it's one of those few things where it's like, I have to understand this, but at the same time, like, you kind of feel like you wish you could have been a barrier, or and you hear this from people in law enforcement all the time. It's like, if only I'd have gotten there sooner, or or maybe if so and so would have been on the case, who knows? There's all kind of variables. But that stuck in my head, and I was like, and so I started doing reading, and that led me to learn that human trafficking was massive, and it was really under the radar, back then, 20 years ago, but still very prominent.
I can't remember it being spoken about at all. The first thing I can think of in like sort of any sort of pop culture is with like Liam Neeson's Taken, which obviously I compare the story to.
Yeah,
that was like a bit of an eye opener for a lot of people, I think, that film.
Yeah, it was. I mean, and a lot of people, they look at that movie and they're like, well, it's a movie, right? We have our suspended belief. This guy's obviously like, and my heart sank, to be honest with you, when that movie came out. I was elated because I was like, oh, this is awesome. But then it was like, well, shit, this was almost what I was going to write, and I hadn't written it yet. So I'm like, well, what do I do now? I was kind of in limbo for a period of time, and I watched it. And then as the other successful movies come out in the series, I was like, oh, well, I can pivot and do this. I'll make it more personal. I'll make it a little bigger, and spread it out more in a particular story arc, based on this guy alone. And I have I'm so excited to write the next book, but I can't write the next book until I can get it out there, because I'm not going to be able to hold on to it. Like I already know how it ends. It's going to be a massive kick in the head for anybody who reads it. I mean, you're going to be like, what just happened? Like that's the way I hope it comes across.
Yeah.
But when that movie came out, I was like, crap, I got to rethink this. But I still hadn't really fleshed it out at the time. I even have a short story version I wrote to just get it out of my head for a period of time. That's similar, but quite different. It's very in a sustained location. And I think it's like 50 or 60 pages. It's like a little novella.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, one day maybe I'll be able to release it and add that to it, or like have a special combo pack or something would be fun. But I mean, I could go on and on. I mean, it's once you go down that rabbit hole, if you have a vigilant mindset, in my opinion, and I'm fairly relentless. Like, I keep learning, and the things that I've learned, like the some of the scenes in the book that I depicted are obvious. They're exaggerations of cases that I'd read on, or stories that I'd heard from, victims' perspectives, and just kind of like, I let it blossom into something that, just so the reader, especially if they're unfamiliar, which is the majority of the population, can get the idea of just how decrepit and disgusting that it's an industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar, $100 billion industry. How disgusting it is, and it needs to be eradicated. And this is my only way of like really getting into it, is like creating someone who knows the plays and has the capabilities, and give him all the resources in the world, and he's just gonna start building a wall of bodies.
We've got a part here actually to that subject of what it's like, and this gives a little bit of a hint without getting anywhere too graphic. I'll just read it out. Right. This is a raid following one of Ghost's raids on where they're holding all the people traffickers, and a SWAT team has gone in after Ghost's massacre to find out what's been going on in this building. My God, the team leader gasped. His words were distorted by the enclosure of the gas mask, giving them an echoed tone and making him sound alien to the English language. The words hung in the air as the energy from Clary's disturbance filtered back to the members of Bravo team. A primal, instinctive characteristic compelled Bravo team to move forward, descending in unison, aiming their rifles and bright tactical lights into the cellar's abyss to see what had garnered such a troublesome reaction. The team stood frozen in abhorrence at the sight they collectively observed. Looks of disbelief were exchanged. How could anyone do this? What lay in front of the secondary SWAT team was a 20 by 20 concrete room filled exclusively with the human product the dead men above ground sought to traffic to unknown destinations. Women and children were packed together with nowhere to relieve themselves except in the spot where they sat or lay, and in turn slept in their own waste. In the white haze of the flashlights, some of the older women, mostly naked or relieved of the majority of their clothes, shielded the children in their immediate grasp. Hair was matted to the sides of heads. Cuts and bruises were evident among the majority of the room's population, including the young girls and some boys. There was no telling how deeply these people were truly wounded. Their exterior and physical injuries would likely be the least of their problems as life moved forward. That's chilling.
A lot of that comes from, like I said, I've listened to a lot of accounts, just read excerpts, things that came up of like how bad, it can be. I mean, trafficking's been depicted in film countless times. I mean, taken most prominently, you have movies like, Men on Fire, The Kidnapping and Ransom. You even have movies with a little bit more levity in it, like Lethal Weapon, I think Lethal Weapon 4.
Oh, yeah.
Where it dealt with the trafficking with the Chinese immigrants. And even then, like, you get the sweatshop aspect, like, or they bring them here and they put them to work to pay off their debt kind of a deal, which is a thing. It's real, but not how they got over here. What was that container like that they were like stuck in for weeks?
Yeah.
That's how, and that still happens. That's still a way of transporting, victims, trafficking them over here. People will pay to be placed there just to get over here and then hopefully get out into the world. Like, it still happens everywhere, all over the world.
Yeah.
And it's horrible. And so I like it. Moments like that, they were hard to write just emotionally.
I bet.
Just thinking of like, what if one of those was somebody I loved?
Yeah.
And then trying to rein that in so that, my fingers will work on the keyboard. You know what I mean?
It's tough to read, to be honest with you. It's tough to read it just then, like, but I felt it was necessary to show that part.
No, I appreciate it. And, it's I'm grateful to hear someone who's, read the words that I've written and, be entertained and, impacted,
Yeah.
to even, find that excerpt to read it, to share with people. Because, I mean, off the subject of writing, just that topic alone is something that I think everybody should be aware of, and it's only going to get worse when I write the next book, and I say that because the subject matter is going to stay the same. And before all the things that have happened over the last 7-8 years, especially concerning like Epstein Island and
yeah.
all the things that surround that, when I was researching over the years, learning that these people, these leaders in our worlds were involved in whatever aspect, like I'd already kind of alluded, like I'd known about it. Like,
yeah.
the rumor of it is out there in the research. There's some place to go for these people to do these horrid things. And so part of my storyline, had I been able to get things gone, consecutively with the next book, lead into that a little deeper, and then goes even farther. I have at least a trilogy planned with this story arc. And so the next book, and with that description and the way you've kind of conveyed how you like, it's chilling to read. Like it almost, it's the blending of genres in that regard for me. Because I mean, that topic alone is a horror story.
Yeah.
And involving that, been having, not necessarily a white knight to come to their aid, but one that's not afraid to get blood on his armor in order to eradicate this issue. And so the next book, when I get the chance to write the sequel, it'll be called A Violent Man. And it'd be like, it's kind of, I think about it like, well, if you've read the first book, no shit, he's a violent man. I'll do my best to watch my language. I'm sorry. But it's gonna go more down that road. And there's going to be some more personal aspects in the next story that will kind of come to the surface, and based off the cliffhanger of where things conclude with A Dangerous Man. So
okay,
I have some great things planned. I just got to be able to get them published together.
Yeah.
And so.
Cool. So I'd say on this topic, it's something that the media doesn't seem massively interested in overall. In fact, there's kind of some weird reactions often to anything that's sort of talking about it. That movie that came out the other year, the Sound of Freedom, there's a very strange reaction from the mainstream media towards that film. It was very negative and in a weird way. It wasn't just critical of like, this isn't a very good movie. It was they were talking about the topic itself and how it was like, it was fantasy, it was over the top, it's ridiculous, it's all this kind of stuff. I found that very weird. So was that something that led you down the road of becoming what we'd say red-pilled?
In this regard, yes, because I discovered in my research, I find organizations I could do research, who are out there, the real heroes, who are out there saving people's lives. They get in, they integrate into the law enforcement. They and coordinate with government leaders in different countries and cities, and across America, across the across even in the UK, Asia. These organizations, because they're built by operators, right? Like there's a lot of special forces men and women who work with them to get on the ground, to do some finding, to role play, to go in and be like, like what Tim does, his character, from Sound of Freedom that Jim Caviezel plays. That's what he did. He would have to pretend he wanted to buy these children and not give away the fact that he's a loving father, a former government agent, like he has to come in and be a creep and be like, how much am I going to pay to have to buy this child, and play a role in order to have them busted. And a lot of Sound of Freedom, I know is based in truth. The ending where he goes one-man army into the jungle, spoiler alert, everybody. That part in there, there's liberties taken there. Like he's admitted, people have asked me, oh, Tim Ballard killed somebody in the jungle. Like, no, that was just kind of for the movie. Like he didn't. And if he did, who cares? Look what the guy was doing. And I, as you can probably tell from my book, I've got a little bit of a morally gray area for that kind of thing. It was like, if someone, I think so. I think it's larger than most people want to admit. But then, like you're saying, you take the way the media spins it, and they take that massive topic, and you're like, oh, this movie is about human trafficking and about a real guy who really goes out and saves kids. And then they try to make everyone think that he's a piece of shit or something.
Weird.
It doesn't make any sense. But I like that question a lot because I had to think about it. Do you know?
Sorry, you broke up a bit there, mate.
Do you know George Carlin, the comedian? He passed away years ago. So he was my favorite comedian ever. Like he's one of the smartest men I've ever seen on stage. Not only being hilarious, but giving you, red pilling you and be like, look, you're not a part of the club. You and I are not a part of the club. We're never going to be a part of the club, kind of a thing. But the moment I heard him say, question everything, something opened up in this big dome here and said, like, well, yeah, you don't have to just accept what people tell you all the time. Like if the news says this, can I look it up? Okay, I can look, oh, this is actually what happened. And they spin it and you start learning those things. And like, well, then it's like, well, now I'm really untrustworthy of the news. It's like, they're not giving me the whole story. They're just giving me their version of the story. what should be like playing telephone. You know, we used to play telephone as kids, where you'd pass the message, and by the time you get to the last person, they're saying something that's not even remotely true or close to the message that originated, you know. And that's what that's become, you know, with that idea in my head. It was like, and I told my daughter that too, like there's been multiple times raising her in situations where it was like, she basically would look at me. I don't swim. Okay. We're on a boat. We're with some people for a week. She can swim. Her mom and I made sure she had lessons. She hated it, but we made sure she could. And here I am, just being a massive wuss, being like, I don't want her going out in that lake. God, what if something happens? I can't come save you. I'm surrounded by people who could, you know, but it was my fear. And she's like, you prepared me for this. You know, I kind of had to have a talk like that, where it was like, you're not trusting me to do what you had me learn how to do.
Yeah.
And I'm confident in doing it. And so it was one of the question everything. So she had to question me, because I was like, oh my God, what happened? What if something happens to my kid out here? I'm fucked. Like, we're both drowning. You know, I'm a rock. I just go. Like, I'm gonna meet the bottom real quick, and I'm not coming up. You know, and that was my fear. And she was like, Dad, you need to take a chill pill. I got this, you know, kind of a deal. She was questioning my motivation. It was my fear, not her fear. Yeah. And so I was glad to instill that in her. And it's one of the things that constantly, I mean, if a person gets red pilled, it's the fact that you're like, well, maybe not everything is what it seems to be. I mean, how famous is that statement? You know?
Yeah.
And so if you keep those things in mind, it should be, and not taking one side or the other, because we know they're there. And both sides are frankly full of shit in a lot of manners. But you ask questions, you know, what if something doesn't make sense? You know, it's like, you're going to tell me that there's a 99% chance I can survive this flu virus, but you want me to get a shot so that I can? That doesn't get in your head and make you ask questions.
Yeah.
You know, and not to call out anybody, but I mean, that right there should have been like, this isn't adding up. It's not mathing, you know? So it was years ago, way back then, probably, well, I can't remember what year George passed, but late 90s. I mean, I was still young. I was 18, 19, 20 when I'd come across that comedy special. And when I heard him say, question everything, something went off in my head, and I've been that asshole ever since. I just have.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I don't have to like the fact if you have a fact to give me, but if it's the truth, not my truth, which I hate that phrase. If it's the truth, I don't have to like it. It just is.
Yeah.
You know, and that's, people seem to have a real big problem with that. And
they want it to fit their own narrative, don't they? Their own idea of what the world is, and it's not always
exactly.
The case.
You know, and like this, it's like some fairy tale land out here, and you can, you know, like, I mean, for Christ's sakes, man, like I live in a fairly conservative county where I'm at. There's a lot of, I have friends who are considered liberals, whatever. They're just be a good person. No one cares about your other whatevers, pronouns and stuff. Like, no one really cares. Just be a decent human being. And it's just one of those things. Like, in the school my daughter went to, there's like a kid, they're furries. You know, they think they're cats. And there's like supposedly a room. Yeah. It's
when they let the kid do that in the school. They let the kid come in dressed as a cat. And
I've only heard this third party from a friend of a friend, and she's pretty trustworthy to me. Yeah. And apparently there's like a litter box room, for these, you know, I mean, and it's not the first time I've heard it. And like, it's the first time I never would have expected it to be. It's one of those things like, is this happening in my area? You know, you think, oh, that'll never happen to me. Well, apparently it's happening in the town right next to me. And I've heard about it on the news. I've heard, like, on Joe Rogan's podcast, people have talked about it. Like, this is a thing. Kids going to school, identifying as animals now. There's another comedian that's pretty funny. I never pronounce his name wrong. I probably shouldn't even say it. Maniscalco, I think. Sebastian Maniscalco, I think is his name. I'm probably butchering that. But he's hilarious. And he's got a bit on that about his kid going to school, and there's like this child in there that identifies as a cat. And it's like, that's a thing. It's a thing that people have been allowing, you know, like, how far have we fallen? How far? You know? And that just makes you wonder, like, I mean, I dealt with a lot of mentally ill people when I was in the jail, and they're a lot easier to relate to than that.
Yeah.
You know, a guy who comes in screaming and smelling like the streets for 60 years, claiming to be Jesus, I can get along with him a lot easier than trying to figure out why you allowed your daughter to go to school thinking she's a feline.
Yeah, it's very cool.
You know what I mean?
Excuse for it.
Yeah. So, I mean, years ago,
we wanted to be superheroes or whatever, didn't we? Like, I think I was about 3, and my mum's told me this story that, like, I wanted to be like He-Man for 5 minutes when I was 3, you know, and went to nursery, and I'd apparently been fighting a bunch of kids being He-Man at school. And she was like, the teachers had to pull her aside, pull me aside, and it was a big thing. I was 3 years old, you know, and nowadays they probably would have let me do that.
Yeah.
He's He-Man if he says he is.
He is, yeah. Give him a sword. Why doesn't he have a sword? Give the boy a sword. Let him, you know, he's the master of the universe now, you know. Now you can't even, like, there's, I mean, I assume based on reading your books how up you are on current events across the world, you know, the way American culture has changed with the acceptance of icons and not, you know, where, you know, you take like Aunt Jemima, who is, I believe, one of the first Black female millionaires in the United States because of her, I mean, for being the face of this brand. And then somebody coming out and telling you that, well, that's racist. First off, this lady, like, her family legacy, you're ruining it by removing her from this. You know, same thing with, there's the NFL team, I think it was the Redskins. Everything, from my understanding, and I could be very wrong, but I've read it a few different times, is that the Redskins was approved by, I don't remember which Indian nation it was, the Native American culture approved it. So that they could use that as their team name and logo. And, you know, I think even a Native American artist made it. I might be wrong there too. But, I mean, there was approval. Like, they didn't just go out and like, oh, yeah, we're going to do it because we're just a bunch of dicks.
Steal it. Yeah.
You know, it sounds cool. You know, there was apparently an approval process. And then over the last few years over here, it's been like, oh, well, that's racist. You can't use that. And like, so you and I now, like, we, like, over here, I grew up, you know, playing Cowboys and Indians or, you know, something like that. And, well, now I'd be racist if I let my kid, you know, what if my son was a history buff and realized what a badass Geronimo or Sitting Bull was, and was like, this guy was so smart and strategical, and he was a leader, you know, and people looked up to him, you know, what a, you know, pick whatever kind of character trait you want to. And he's like, I want to be Geronimo for Halloween. And be like, oh, we can't, son. That's racist.
Yeah.
You know, you can't celebrate somebody you look up to now because they might look different. I'm like, everything's really twisted now, you know, cultural appropriation, all these things that just, I mean, they're looked at sideways when you have all the good meaning in the world to be the master of the universe, you know? I mean, everything's perverted in some aspect, and it's, I mean, I hope we're turning around a lot because
I think we just need to stop listening to those people. Like, it's as simple as that. They're just buzzkills, aren't they? They just want to go around and sort of slag everyone else off to try and make themselves look good. Like, oh, look, I decided that box was racist, so got it banned. I'm a great person. It's like, but the box wasn't racist.
Right.
You know, I was in the bookshop earlier today, actually, and there were these 3 kids in the corner. The kids are probably in their 20s or uni or something. And they were literally going around the bookshelves going, that's a racist author, that's a racist author, oh, he's a racist. And I was just like, what are you doing in here? You know?
Yeah.
They're ridiculous.
Have you even read the
way to like live your life, you know? And that was how they were getting their kicks on a Friday afternoon, going to a bookshop and point out everyone that they think is, and it was people who clearly aren't. It was talking about Stephen King and stuff like that, and it was like, come off it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, to find that as a extracurricular activity, you know, there's some failings, you know, in that growth process. I mean, you could even call it, like, I think you could even say it's globally. I know it's definitely here, you know, that's an indoctrination process. I mean, you got to teach people to think that way.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, if you were able to walk up to them and say, well, here, let's play a game here. Question everything. Why do you think this is racist? Okay, open the book up. Read the book. Now, is he telling historical facts? Is he twisting it for a particular character's perspective to make you not like them? Like, what's racist? You know, like they say that, like Quentin Tarantino movies, there's his depictions of with black people, like, you know, saying the N-word, and he's a white man who wrote this in his story. He was like, well, he's talking about gangsters in the 70s or whatever it is, you know, you go from Jackie Brown to Django Unchained, you know, talking about slavery, and
that is accurate.
You know, it's just, I mean, it's accuracy. So is he being racist, or is he just being like historically accurate? And the people who work with him were like, look, this is what they did back then. He's by no means celebrating it. You know, this isn't.
It would be worse to ignore it.
Yeah, I mean, could you imagine watching that movie without them saying certain things and being like, who made this? Like, and I'm not asking for anybody to go out there and start saying that word. I don't like the word, but you can't chastise a man for being historically accurate. Like, there were pieces, you know, there were people, horrible people back then, you know, obviously, like, you know, like Leo's character, you know, from Candyland, you know, like, that acted and said those things. And his whole point of the movie was freeing a man so they could kill those fools. And we loved it. Yeah. We loved the fact that he got redemption, got his wife back, and all the horrible people, you know, met their end with a bullet. You know, like, that was what I watched the movie for. You know, great performances, and there's even a story with I guess Leonardo DiCaprio had a hard time saying the word, and Jamie Foxx talks about it.
I can imagine.
Sam Jackson comes in and says, "Man, just do your job and say what you got to say." And I mean, I'm not going to say what he said, but he's like, you know, he's like, say the lines, perform the lines, do the lines, like. He's like, well, Sam, you're my friend. He's like, yeah. He goes, not when the camera's rolling, you know. And he's like, you're the candy man, whatever, and I'm so and so, and this is how you talk to me. Do your job. And so he did, and they nailed it, and it's historically accurate, not just because it's not because Quentin's racist, or, you know, if you read, I mean, certain books where people write depictions. Well, I bet they know someone who talked like that, and that's why they're there, because they're like, I want to put this kind of person in my story, and then if we're lucky enough, they'll kill them, because those people, we don't need those people here. We don't need that.
Would you say Tarantino was an influence on you?
Yeah. I mean, I like a lot of his movies. I like, there's some that I don't really grab me, but I mean, he's a pretty prolific storyteller, you know, and has definitely been an influence. A lot of filmmakers have. He's particularly one of them. I'm a big fan of Antoine Fuqua. Man on Fire, Tears of the Sun is one of my favorite movies.
Training Day, was that him?
Yes, yeah, Training Day. I mean, anything that man does, he's a great storyteller, you know.
Yeah.
And I love the Magnificent Seven remake that he did with Denzel and Chris Pratt, and I mean the whole cast is amazing. But he did a great job with the material, you know. I mean, we've seen it. I grew up watching the original movie, you know, on TV and everything, and to see it remade was one of those things where it's like, why are they doing this? But then I'm like, oh, well, that man, Antoine Fuqua, he killed it, in my opinion. I enjoyed the movie a lot. Southpaw, you know, his dedication. He worked out with Jake Gyllenhaal doing boxing, getting in preparation for the role, so he was in it with him, you know. And I mean, there's a lot of filmmakers that I'm probably a little more influenced by film than I am books.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a handful of guys growing up reading, and some series I've read over the years of authors that their characters have been an influence just because, you know, they were just badass.
You give me some.
I started reading. James Patterson is a big one.
Oh yeah.
Him and as a side note, him and Nick Horvath with Sledge versus the Labyrinth, right?
Yeah.
I could almost say that I detest first person point of view, right? Like reading it. Not since reading James Patterson have I been drawn into a story that's first person since I read Nick's book.
Yeah.
And for me, that's pretty important because when you'll get them, everyone's talking about this book, you know, I was like, okay, and you look at the cover. I mean, if you got to judge the book by the cover because that's he did an amazing job with everything around Sledge, his website, his design for his cover, you know, you look at that cover and be like, oh, I'm going to read that.
Yeah. It's great. Like very Sin
Yeah.
City. You know what you're in for with that one. It's
yeah.
going to be gritty. It's going to be brutal.
And what's awesome is that he's a physics teacher, you know. It's like he's like obviously an incredibly intelligent man writing, you know, a book about a giant man who smashes people with sledgehammers. You know, it's like right on. I mean, we have our dichotomies, right?
Yeah. Well, he's a giant man himself, though, isn't he?
Yeah. Oh God, yeah, he is, isn't he? You know, and he's drawing, and he's drawing from his, you know, he draws from his life experiences.
Yeah.
That you can tell that they're in there. But James Patterson, a lot, the Alex Cross novels were really big. The first, I've read some of the first ones. I get bored with series, so I'll read like 5, 6, 10 maybe, and then I cut out. Like
I think that's enough. I'm very similar.
You know, and so, but James Patterson and James Patterson is a huge influence also in the manner of crossing genres. You know, writing different stories. I mean, he has he has the YA books he's written with the mutant kids that are kind of like angels or something like that. That was fun. It's more PG-13 PG-13 kind of writing, you know, outside of like Kiss the Girls, you know, which is about serial killers, you know, and whatnot. So that ability was always like, as an author, he can write a thriller. He can write. He's written, I think, romantic thrillers. You know, different male characters, female characters. You know, it's like he has such a broad variety of things he's able to do very well. He influenced me to actually get my book written because he was the first person to have a class, or the first writer to have an online class on what the heck is it called? It's called Masterclass, masterclass.com. So the first person to have a writing online course. And I got that and used it because he went over everything he did with publishing, talking about storylines, even co-authoring and whatnot, how to write an outline. Because I never used to write outlines until I did his little course, because it I would have an idea. I'd write. I'd get into it pretty deep, and then like squirrel. I have a new idea. I got to write it down. I start writing it down. I start writing, and then I'm doing something completely different. I don't finish.
Right.
And so his course helped me to focus what I wanted to accomplish by writing an outline now. And that's part of my process. So he's been hugely influential unknowingly to him, because later Masterclass offered a contest with James Patterson to win. The grand prize was co-authoring a book with him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so I was like, oh, that, like, how iconic would that be to work with someone so prolific? Yeah. And going through his course again, I used A Dangerous Man as my entry idea. And I think I used the short story I'd written initially. Only so many pages had to be submitted as the idea for it. And going back through his class and looking at things, I was like, oh, I'm not gonna win. We write too differently. Like there has to be a little bit of more gel between styles, I think. And I was like, oh, I didn't even make it past the second part of the contest. The second part was submitting a full outline of your story. Right. And I'd gotten in on it from the ground up. So it was right at the very beginning of the process. So I knew how long I had to do what. So after I made my first submission, I started working on the outline, going over his instructionals on how to do that or how he does it. And in the course, he had a printout for an outline of a book he did that outside of his agent, no one else ever reads. And so I used that as a guide to help me with kind of step by step getting my story from the beginning to end down so that I could follow it in order to actually finish the story. And I started doing that. And I was like, okay, I didn't make it to the second round, but I started this. And I'm like, well, I should finish it. So I finished it. And when I finished it, I'm like, well, now it's time to write the book. Yeah. And so his writing has been a massive influence on me. I read a lot of his books. David Morrell is another one. He's an absolute legend.
First Blood.
Yeah, First Blood. I mean, everyone knows he created Rambo.
Yeah.
The Brotherhood of the Rose is it's like the thriller of thriller books to read. I still see, because I know Jack Carr, who writes the Terminal List books, James Reese stories, is a massive fan also of David Morrell. And so
there's our mate Dave Bazan.
Yeah, Dave, and I mean, Dave is so knowledgeable and a huge fan and such a great guy.
He's always in the Lair of Legends, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. He definitely knocked it out of the park with his book. And we've talked about, like, I think he actually got like a signed book from David Morrell or something like that.
Oh wow, cool.
And I was like, but I've been able to correspond with David Morrell on X, since I only got on there to promote my book initially in the first place. And he'll comment sometimes, and we'll have a conversation going back and forth for a few days on
that's cool
at times. And my favorite book to this day is one of his, and it's called The Fifth Profession. And I had to read it the first two times I read it. The first time I'm like, my brain can't get around the psychological thriller aspect of this novel, because when I first read it, so I was like, I had to put it down and come back to it a couple of years later and then read it, and then I could really drink it in and absorb it. And I was like, this is the best book I've ever read, and it's still my favorite book today. I love that book. I read it at least once a year, probably.
Yeah, it's cool. So your style, you say, would it have? Do you think you found your writing style while you were going through that James Patterson process? You found what your voice was there.
I'd written on and off before I actually wrote that book. My style actually varies quite a bit because of James Patterson. because seeing that an author can do what he does. And I think there's probably a really good balance with his style of writing. Excuse me. But depending on the tone I'm looking for, depending on the storyline, like I said, I generally will write pretty serious and dark, with some moments of levity, that are the natural human things, not to just inject comedy, but like, well, this could happen. I mean, you've worked, and then what you've done, people are the strangest thing out there, and they do the damnedest things that you're like, that didn't just happen, but it did. And it's literally stranger than fiction, because you're like, you couldn't make this stuff up, And so, moments like that, when I can, just to maybe break the tension when I feel like it's necessary, if it serves the story, if it serves the character, because the story to me is always paramount. But I change. My style changes. Like I have 2 books that I'm going to be working on getting out there right now. One has kind of a Southern drawl tone to it, reading it.
Okay.
And the other one is, and that's more of a crime thriller. And it's called The Dock. And then I just wrote kind of a horror. I have probably, this is probably your fault, actually, I've had more of a horror aspect. Like I like the horror genre in general, and I have not actually read a lot in that genre. Yeah. I'm very green when it comes to reading horror novels. But probably it was either just before or reading yours was like helping for inspiration. Was like, I've been like, if I come up with an idea, like the last 3 ideas I've come up with have been like horror genre based.
Cool.
You know what I mean? And so you're probably at fault for some of that. I mean, when the books come out, you're definitely going to be getting a call out, my man.
Oh, cool. I'm proud of that.
Because it's a great genre, because it's fluid and it's broad. You can do pretty much anything, in terms of it. And some of them have been like, well, if this would be made into a movie, it'd kind of be like a horror comedy, or this one would be, maybe just a straight horror. Like I love the slasher genre mostly. Yeah. And so a few of them are kind of more in that wheelhouse, and they're knocking on the door, back there. I have some other things I have to get done before I can try to do something new. But they're there, and I'm excited to get them on the page in some fashion, whether it's for a novel or for a screenplay, because I started writing screenplays.
Oh, cool.
A few years ago too. So some of them like, well, it'll just be easier to put it make it as a movie. Yeah. Then I also like the idea of being able to write.
John Davies. I know he's working on a screenplay at the moment.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, Muscle. He's turning that into a
really?
Screenplay. Yeah.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, I am a friend of mine. My little brother that I worked with, that I mentioned, we were working together one night. It was slow, and we watched a video game trailer. He remembers which one it was. I don't. And then he just had this concept come up and be like, well, what if like a group of us just got together and we all like, he goes like, I know guns in this, and you know this and this, and if we found someone who could do this and people who could do this, maybe we could just like go on like a trip and then like take out a cartel boss or something like that. Was kind of the concept. Right. And then that night, because it was a really slow night, he was in a control room one half, and then I was in it the other. We're emailing back and forth. Like we have like a long list of like ideas and coming up with characters, and so we had all these things fleshed out, and I worked on my book, got that going. He changed jobs. He became a canine officer for our local PD for a period of time. And this is years ago. It was like 7-8 years ago almost. And after 2021, after my book came out, I was like, well, what am I going to do next? And then I had some inspiration. I was like, our idea came back to me, and I messaged him and I said, hey man, I'm going to start working on this. So get ready to start getting some emails from me. I'm going to need your input. And then I started doing research and kind of taught myself how to write, the concept or the standard of what goes into writing screenplays, reading screenplays, watching instructional videos, people talking about how it gets done. And I was like, I'm just going to write an outline and just write the story. And then I'll figure out the details after that. And so we worked on that for a period of time, and we wrote one. We entered it into contests, got some good feedback, was pretty consistent. And then I found a company that kind of bridges the gap between the writers and producers, to help either, like, you could just pitch your idea and they could find somebody to write it, and then you could work with them to refine it story-wise and whatnot. Or like we'd written one, and I pitched it to a producer. His name was Garrick Dion. He was super awesome. He and I clicked real fast. He wasn't able to work on it with us, unfortunately. But what the guys in the company told me was like, well, he usually says no, like, to most things. He said yes to our idea. And then next thing I know, I'm doing an acquisitions type phone call to be like, well, yeah, we want to work with you to have you work with a producer to develop it. And we went through that process. We did that for about a year, working on rewrites and things like that. And
wow,
first guy we worked with didn't kind of go so well. The second guy we worked with was awesome. He was exactly the kind of instructor we needed. And currently he's shopping it for us. So
okay, cool.
There'll hopefully be a movie announcement in the future,
Amazing.
of some kind. Hopefully we'll get a sale. So, working on that too. So that's kind of conceptually, like, I like the movies. Well, I was like, what if I write my own? And for a period of time, my friend Steven is his name. He's like, why don't we just direct it ourselves? And I'm like, that's a great idea, but neither one of us have any idea what we're doing.
Yeah.
So let's just stick to writing. We can kind of control that, and then we'll just ride that train as far as we can and see where it takes us. So we're hoping to hear something from that in the near future, so but every time I get an idea, it's like, okay, is this a screenplay or is this a novel? And it's like, well, I'll write the screenplay and be like, well, I kind of want to write the book now. Out a little bit more, and so it becomes addicting to a certain degree.
Yeah. Got another example of your style here. I wanted to go into
okay.
Just after talking about that. There's a seemingly distinct sound to bone when it is traumatized. Even the slightest break can produce a thunderous crack. A fracture can snap like a whip. The audio tone of bone can vary, and Ghost thought he'd heard them all. Once he broke a man's kneecap with a mildly powered sidekick to the fragile joint, and the soundtrack played out as though a wet towel had been slapped against a brick wall. It was as though the dislocation of the joint ripped through the tendons and the connective tissue cried out in pain. Spiral and compound fractures varied between snaps and rolling crunches, but what remained, regardless of the type of break, was the memory of what was heard. Nails scratching on chalkboard came close to the cringeworthy sound. Vladimir Kurakova's head played out to the same effect of an eggshell cracking against cement. Love that bit.
I sometimes forget how elaborate some of it is. I don't know. I can't remember where or why. Like, I could have summed that up probably, but to have that effect, of like, whoa. I never anticipated it so much until I wrote this book to realize like how impactful reading is. Like, people, when, I'm sure people who are close to you are like, holy crap, Steve, I read something you wrote, like, wow. And you realize, like, you could see it in their face, you can see it in their eyes, where, like, it's like, I might have changed you a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, you have, like, I've had people say some, pretty great things. Like, I've made people cry, get their adrenaline going while they're reading. And I'm like, that rarely happens to me. but there's been times that it does. I mean, here's another thing that you're at fault for. I was reading Violent Ends, and there's a scene in the club when the demon has the club owner, I don't remember his name, I apologize.
Oh, Brian, that's okay.
And the whole, you know, like in his dude, I wanted to yak. Like I was like, oh, like it impacted me, and it's something you don't forget. I think I'm like, oh Jesus, like I could almost feel it raining down on me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it was like, which I mean, I would hope is like what the response you would want, and be like, ugh! Like,
yeah,
oh my God,
absolutely.
Like, I literally was like, oh God, like I wanted to choke, like I wanted to get it out of me, like I was experiencing it. You did an amazing job, dude. But to have that effect on a reader, I think you have to have a lot of talent. You have to understand behavior. You have to understand like what can get a response. And I can't tell you specifically like that excerpt there what was going through my head, other than like just devastate them as much as possible.
Yeah.
You know, because I've had bones broken. I've in training, and you know, more accidentally than not. I mean, I've hurt people, you know, had broken a bone or something, or witnessed it happening. And it to me, it's a sound that, like, that's where that came from. Was like, it sticks with you when you hear it. You're like,
yeah.
You know. And I wanted to make that moment as impactful as possible. I think. And the smile on your face tells me that.
That can only come from your experience as well. That's not something that just anyone could write.
I mean, true. I mean, I'm sure you've got training. I'm sure you know people who've been there. And I mean, when you watch a guy do jiu-jitsu, and you got the guy who don't want to tap to an arm bar, something's gonna give. And then you're like, oh God, man. Like it's not a joyous sound by any means, but it's definitely one where you're like, oh, damn. Like, okay. But then when you notice a guy who doesn't react when that happens, and you're like, okay, that's a tough son of a bitch. But it's a sound. I can't tell you I remember what it sounded like when my leg broke, but what I was told was that it sounded like a thunder crack.
Wow.
I got slid into on third base my last practice before the first game of my very first time I ever played t-ball. And between the runner's foot sliding into the base, where my foot was, and the way the base was kind of located, just kind of, and I never touched the ground. I was lucky to have my dad there, who was a third base coach, like just scooped me up, yelled at my sister to get in the truck. And then I woke up in the hospital. I don't know how long later. But everybody was like, they didn't really so much remember the incident. They just remember what it sounded like. And that really resonated with me as having like an impact. Trying to describe something like that, I think, is probably where that resonated, because that sound is very distinct. I mean, you hear it. It sounds like a lot of other things, like snapping a brick wall, for instance, and depending on how big the bone is, you know, or how much of the bone is broken, or how badly it's broken. And I've seen x-rays of them. I've seen, you know, and I did a lot of research as I wanted to kind of have like a really good image in my head and be like, oh yeah, this is
good. You got the experience and you did the extra research on top.
Yeah, I tried to add a little bit of medical, like, I mean, not so much medical, but I looked at stuff to be like, okay, how can I describe that depicts what I kind of want to do here? How can I describe it? And one of the things I like to do when I write is give enough to where at times give enough to where like you can like, okay, I know what he's saying. Like, you know, like if guys are fighting and their fists are flying and they're parrying and ducking and moving and firing back, you know, and is one thing. But then if something like that, like I'm like that guy needed in the story, as far as the storyline goes, that guy needed to die, and we needed to feel it.
It's got that thing of grossing you out, but being really satisfying at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, it's the payoff. I think a lot of writers don't write to the payoff enough, and that's something that I'm like, okay, this is going to be awesome. This has to be awesome. This has to be like, someone has to be like, you know what? Maybe that ghost guy's like, he's kind of maybe a bad dude, but thank God he's doing what he's doing.
He's on the right side.
Yeah, you know. And so.
Cool. So there's plenty more moments like that in Dangerous Man. Everyone should check it out. Okay.
Thank you.
Have you got anything else you'd like to say? Anything you'd like to plug before we go?
Nothing that I can really like bring any. There's nothing physical I can have anybody get their hands on just yet. I'm working on some things to kind of catch up, and again, I have the 2 books I mentioned, the doc, and the other one's called Where the Children Don't Lie, or Where the Children Don't Play. Excuse me. That's a horror monster thriller that I wrote recently that I'm going to be working on getting out there a little bit more. I actually got Dave's opinion. Dave Buzine read it, you know, with what he did with Lair, and everything. And that guy's a master at writing like blurbs, man. Like
they just come to him like that. It seems he's amazing.
He could do if he could teach it, he could do a masterclass. But I mean, absolutely, I've never seen anybody write like. He sent me like 4 of them. He's like, yeah, feel free to use these when you get your book out there and you're sending it out and stuff, you know. And I'm like, Dave, how do I pick, man?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, he does it so amazingly. Like,
he's earlier today.
Yeah, I mean, he's got a gift with that. I'm not as good as that as him. That's one thing where I was like, I concede. You know what I mean? And, we all have our strengths and stuff, and that's definitely a strength of Dave. But I appreciated his time and feedback on that, and I'll probably, I might hit you up if you want to give it a read ahead of time. I'm just trying to query agents and publishers. I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing. I got to get some more detail things in the mix so I can get it out there. But I wrote it, so I want to get it out there in some way, whether I have to wind up doing it myself or if I can get representation, or, you know, it'll get out there one way or the other. So
where can people find you? You said X earlier. Are there any other places?
They can find me on X. I don't even know what my tags are, man. JL Engel, I think 5 on X. If you look up J Engel author on Instagram below. And I can send them to you on Facebook. JL Engel author, I believe, also on Facebook. Like, once I put them on, one of them people were like, I put them on there. I don't even pay attention to how to get a hold of me. I liked your question so much. I've been thinking about so many things. Like, we could probably talk for another hour or so on some of the topics, and it's, I mean, I don't get a chance to do this stuff, so hopefully it wasn't rambling too often.
Absolutely not, mate. No, it's fine. We can carry on talking after if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm down for it, man. I mean, it's great to be able to speak with you. You're across the pond, so to speak, and it's been great to meet you and talk. And thank you for having me on here. I appreciate it very much.
Mate. Absolute pleasure.
Awesome.
Catch you again.